We can get started with our introductory remarks. Leave a few more minutes for people to come and join the webinar. So hello, everybody, and welcome to the Armenian Bar Association Young Lawyers Committee webinar, episode 9 on emerging and developing areas of law. Today's topic is international human rights law. My name is Anaïs Kadian. I'm a civil and commercial litigation lawyer at LCM Attorneys in Montreal. I'm very honored to be moderating this panel today, and we have a really great panel lined up in the next hour in which our guests are going to introduce us to their practice areas, to their career paths, offer insights and advice, both for new attorneys entering the field of international human rights law, or for seasoned attorneys who are looking to also practice in this area and want to know how they can do that. We'll also have time for questions, so feel free to put those in the chat. And I'll start right away with introductions of our esteemed panelists. So we have with us today Sheila Pailan, who is an international legal and gender consultant at the UN and OSCE. Sheila has more than 15 years of experience as a legal advisor to the UN. She's advised judges and senior officials of various UN international criminal tribunals. From 2019 to 2021, she was appointed by the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights as the legal advisor and sexual and gender-based violence specialist to a team of experts assisting judicial and military authorities of the DRC with investigating gross human rights violations and abuses. She's now based in Yerevan, and she consults for a variety of international organizations, NGOs, think tanks, governments, including the Republic of Armenia in its cases against Azerbaijan before the International Court of Justice. We also have with us Nicholas Kumjian. He's the head of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, to which he was appointed by the UN Secretary General in 2019. He has the mandate to collect and analyze evidence of serious international crimes committed in Myanmar. He was a prosecutor in LA from 1981 to 2000, and in the last 20 years has worked in various international positions, including prosecuting international crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia, Timor-Leste, Sierra Leone, and Cambodia. Next on our panel is Levon Golenduin, attorney with the firm Eversheds Sutherland's US LLP. He specializes in international dispute resolution with a focus on investment treaty arbitration, international commercial arbitration, and transnational commercial litigation. Levon has appeared in both federal and state courts and before arbitration tribunals. His clients range from sovereign states to private companies in a variety of fields. And Levon also co-chairs the International Investment and Development Committee of the American Bar Association and the Armenia Programs Committee of the Armenian Bar Association. Levon is recognized by the Legal 500 USA as a key lawyer in international arbitration. And last but not least, Alex Bedrosian, attorney with Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, based in Washington, D.C. His practice focuses on public international law, investment treaty arbitration, and international commercial arbitration. He has particular experience assisting in disputes involving former Soviet republics. His pro bono practice consists largely of international human rights law matters, and he's represented parties before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, and UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. For the past 2 years, Alex was also recognized by the Legal 500 in the United States in the field of international arbitration. So welcome all. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to start off with an open question to all panelists, so feel free to jump in to talk a little bit about what type of field you work in and what your practice looks like and how did you get into this area. So talk to us a little bit about I know you have all very different backgrounds, so we're all curious to hear a little bit about that. Sheila, do you want to start?
Sure. So I'm an mainly international criminal lawyer. I've spent most of my career specializing in international criminal law, working at the international criminal tribunals. which, you know, has as its sort of underlying factor gross human rights violations. So it's sort of like a specialized branch of international human rights law, or there's a lot of overlap. And most of my career was really as like an international civil servant, working for these big, for the UN, nothing but the UN, up until actually right after the war, when I decided that I wanted to move to Armenia and live in Armenia. So now my practice is, I'm not an employee of international organizations, I'm a consultant. Like I lend my services, and now the organization is more like my client. And I've also branched out into working a lot on gender issues, which I find really new and exciting. It's been a couple of years, but it's quite different from your typical, what for me is typical ICL, you know, international criminal law stuff, and a little bit more human rightsy. So yeah, I take on sort of short-term contracts and deliver, and it takes me around the world, and I can do it while being based in Armenia. So that's kind of what I do.
Very cool. Next, Nicholas.
Sure. Well, similar to Sheila, my work has mainly been in the field of international criminal law, which makes sense since I was a domestic prosecutor in the United States for a very long time before going into the international field. So I've worked on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, those cases in different international tribunals, and now a mechanism. Mechanisms are a new type of entity created in the UN, where frankly, there's not enough political will to create a court or tribunal, but recognizing the need to preserve evidence and that someday there would be justice, the United Nations has created now 3 mechanisms with the mandate to collect evidence of the most serious crimes and to prepare files that could facilitate criminal prosecutions in other international or national courts. And in my career, I have dabbled a couple of times. I had shorter jobs, one on anti-corruption and another on more broadly, anti-corruption was in the Eastern Europe, and more broadly on human rights in Colombia, where the organization, it was funded by the United States, it's the US Program for Human Rights in Colombia, and did things like early warnings of human rights violations, protection of those at risk, human rights workers at risk, and trainings on human rights.
Great. Alex?
Sure. Yeah, I work in the private sector for a large law firm in public international law. A big part of my job is representing parties in disputes between foreign investors and the states where the investment was located. These are done pursuant to a network of treaties. And the goal of these treaties was to depoliticize these disputes. So if a Canadian investor has a problem with the US, the Canadian investor can directly try to enforce his or her own rights instead of running to the government of Canada to try to raise the matter politically or diplomatically. So disputes with foreign investors do not turn into irritants in the diplomatic interstate relations. How I fell into it, I mean, it was kind of organic. I went in undergrad, I studied a lot of foreign languages, including in high school, as well as comparative politics. Then I found a firm, a current firm actually, they needed a paralegal with certain language expertise. And this field, it involves really knowing the political landscape in different countries. So it was really a natural fit. And then I came back. And this billable work kind of translates really easily into pro bono human rights law work when we represent individuals who have faced alleged human rights abuses. And I've also represented states as well in some interstate arbitration. And Yeah, other type of human rights pro bono work includes writing reports for like ghost writing the reports for prominent NGOs, and kind of building the record, so that interested actors can use it however they want. And recently, on behalf of the Armenian Bar Association, I made presentations, written and oral, to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And based on that, yesterday it published, 2 days ago, it released its report, making many critical findings of Azerbaijan's treatment of ethnic Armenians, which are exactly the type of international legal documents that can have political value if used properly by the very relevant governments.
Great, thank you. And Levon.
Similar to Alex, my practice is in international disputes at a major international law firm. By and large, we also do investment treaty arbitration, and plus, pro bono human rights work on the side, and increasingly also business and human rights consulting. And I came into the field also fairly immediately out of law school, and I discovered the field during law school. I'd gone to law school knowing I wanted to do some sort of international economic law, and then I learned about commercial international arbitration, and got to know more and realized there was this sort of niche practice that involved both sort of the soft skills of litigation and advocacy and the academic and substantive knowledge of various fields of public international law. And the biggest draw for me about the field was that every case you're merging at least 2 or 3 different fields of international law and 1 or 2 national law provisions, and coming up with creative and complex questions and answers.
Great. We have time for a quick question. Alex, we have a watcher who's asking, what was the report that you mentioned that you worked on related to Armenia and Azerbaijan? I think that's the report that you were talking about on behalf of the ABA.
Parts of it, yeah. Another was an individual complaint on behalf of a woman who was displaced from Hadrut by the war. And the thrust of the report was this war didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a context of the Aliyev dictatorship basically being built on hatred against ethnic Armenians for 29 years. And the CERD committee, it decided to not consider that as an individual complaint, but pass it off to the country review process. So it's an interesting insight into the different mechanisms that some of these treaties set up to hold countries accountable. One is the ability to hear complaints from individuals after exhausting local remedies. And another is the treaty bodies periodically review the country's compliance as a general matter. Both are very important.
Great. So my next question is to Nick and Sheila, since you have particular background working with UN bodies. For our viewers who are just starting out in their legal careers, what advice would you have for them on if they wish to continue like in that direction? What do you wish that you knew when you started out, and what insight could you provide them?
Sheila, do you want to go first?
Sure, because I know what you're going to say. No, I'm kidding. Actually, I kind of know what you're going to say. Or it sort of complements what you would say. I'm not going to say I wish I did something differently, but I do feel like I lacked. I basically started my UN career straight out of law school, and so I had no domestic experience. And it's okay, like that's a way to do it, but I think it's really actually very, very important to have at least a few years of domestic experience. So most, it's not very it's not very common to quickly get into the like that quickly to get into the UN, but I often see I often met, because I ran the internship programs and everything, and internships are very important when that is a path you want to go on. You'll have to do at least one internship, either during law school or right after. But then, for those people who end up, pursuing LLMs and maybe even PhDs because they want it so bad, and I'm just like, go home and work at home first. Don't be so obsessed with the idea of the international stuff, because you have to kind of, I think it's really, really valuable to have experience at the domestic level first. And then also NGO work is also very important, because it shows like that it's also something I didn't do until I left the UN. Or actually, when I started working more in the field and out of the courts, I saw how interesting and like how valuable it is to be able to work for an organization that doesn't have so much red tape around it, and like gets things done faster, even on smaller budgets. I was like, why can't we do that? Well, because we have to fill out millions of forms and get approval at 500 levels. Like there's a huge difference. There's a lot of, okay, here's something I did wish, or that I would tell someone knowing now. It's not as glamorous or as sort of sexy as it seems. You're not saving the world. You are part of something big. You are part of something important, but it's not the ultimate or only way. So if it's what you really want, like an internship is what you're going to have to do, and then figure it out. That's my advice.
And when you say you appreciate, you would advise someone to get domestic level work, do you mean to develop their skills as lawyers, or just to have a background in?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about what my first 15 years working in the international courts, and I worked with the judges the whole time. So I'm drafting decisions and judgments, like I'm researching, I'm analyzing evidence, and I'm doing this all without having ever done it at the domestic level, So there were a lot of concepts that I learned in practice there. And because it's an international environment, it's mixing legal traditions. And I often felt like I didn't have as firm a grasp of certain concepts, because they weren't being, you have to use them in practice in the environment in which they're created and applied. And then take them to the international level. So I got it, but like it was a lot of asking. It was a lot of work, and there's a certain feeling for the law that you get by working at the domestic level that you don't have at the international level. That you're meant to sort of bring it with you, and then create this new body of law with what you bring from the domestic level, and then maybe you can go back and forth. But yeah, don't be too eager. Like, you got a lot more to bring to the table if you get it at home first. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Patience and practice. How about you, Nick?
Yeah, my advice would be, well, first of all positions in the UN are very competitive. I would say for our mechanism, which is based in Geneva, which is obviously a pretty easy place to live. A lot of people want to live there. It's a family post. We probably get at least a couple hundred applications for every position. So, do not get too disappointed when you don't get interviewed or don't get shortlisted. It's extremely competitive, and frankly, things just have to break your way for you to get that first job. And I think in looking at my career, the really luckiest point I ever had was getting the first job in the UN. Getting interviewed for that. And I heard I was originally on the reject list, and someone put me in the interview pile. What I would say to people, there's UN jobs are advertised on a website. I forget what it is called, UN Jobs. I'm sure you can find it by Googling.
It's Kira,
Sarah.
careers.un.org. I mean,
Okay, thank you.
Nick.
Yeah. I haven't applied for a job in quite a while. But on these, one thing to be aware of, please do not just do one formula application for all jobs. When we're reviewing people's applications, it's so obvious when you read that this is the same application the person put in for 20 other jobs that have nothing to do with what we do. The job advertisement will list the requirements for the job. If it says things like you have to have a Myanmar language, you have to have one. It's not going to do you any good to apply if you don't have one of those languages. And then there are desirables. But sometimes these applications are weeded out by the human resource people before I or others in my mechanism that actually do the selection ever see them, because people do not make it clear that they fulfill the requirements. So one of the things I would suggest is in your cover letter, you go through the requirements and the desirables and make your argument of how you feel your experience fills both the requirements and as many of the desirables as possible. One of the things we're limited, definitely influences decisions now, is we have to have gender balance, which especially for the younger positions, it's not any problem. We probably have more women applying than men, and more women in our more junior positions than men. In some of the more senior positions or specialized work like security and IT, there tends to be many more male applicants than female applicants. And the other, but we have to try to balance at all grades. And also we have to balance geographically. So sometimes a person is selected or not selected because they come from the group of states that is overrepresented already in our mechanism. That's something you can't really control. I'm just mentioning it so you understand the process. I do think internships are a very good idea. I mean, as much international experience as you can get if you want to transition from domestic to international. Languages are very important. But I did volunteer work also for the American Bar Association. I think maybe that helped me get that first interview. I was very briefly in the diplomatic service. I've seen people who were excellent, very, very highly regarded trial lawyers in their domestic countries not get shortlisted for an international job, because when they're applying for more senior positions with no international experience, frankly, they're not going to be interviewed because there's enough people on the list who's have worked in international courts and whose work is known, that you're not going to be selected if you don't have any international experience.
Well, thank you. That's very, very insightful. And we have our work carved out in front of us for those who want to make it through there. My next question maybe is towards more Alex and Levon, who are both private practitioners domestically, but who do pro bono work in international human rights law. And I understand you don't necessarily, or maybe you do, like you might want to correct me, but you work more on the civil side versus the criminal side. Maybe you could explain what advice you'd give to a seasoned lawyer who wants to branch out into international human rights, but that doesn't necessarily have a criminal law practice and has more of a private law, civil practice like you guys have.
I'll start. I agree with what Sheila said pretty much entirely, in the sense that, so assuming you've done domestic work for several years and you want to transition, there are certain skills that you can learn domestically that will both help your marketability and will help you do the job well when you make the transition. This sounds trite, but being very good at factual development, finding facts yourself, making the inferences, very good eye for detail, things like managing teams, because on these international cases, you have a local expert in whatever country there is. The client is in another time zone, speaking another language. You have various like economic experts, maybe even legal experts. You just have to be very good at recognizing all the different tasks that are required in a project, recognizing who can add the most value on those tasks, staying on top of them, and overseeing it all and making sure it's all coherent, even as everyone is working in their little silos. So just being a good litigator and a good manager are very important. And if you have those at the domestic level, you can use them to market yourself, and it shows you know about the reality of the job, and it'll help you do the job. But also, frankly, you need, I mean, there are some international skills that you need. I mean, if you are familiar with the difference between common law and civil law in practice, not just in theory. And if I could relive my life again, I would have gone to McGill and spent my 20s in Montreal, like learning both and loving Montreal.
We're pretty civil law here, though, I must say. But in theory, yes, at McGill we do cover it. Sorry?
Not at McGill. Not at McGill.
McGill, yes, it's covered in theory, but in practice in Montreal.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, criminal is common, isn't it?
Yeah, criminal is federal. Yeah.
But also, like, and really knowing the theory of some legal concepts are very important. Like in investment law, we deal with very complicated issues of property law. So if you remember the rule against perpetuities for American trained lawyers, it's like you have to kind of apply that to, but the version in a foreign country's legal system. And you have to be able to learn it yourself, explain it, and explain it convincingly, like put a frame on it to these arbitrators. Yeah. And so, I mean, just having, if you know it like deeply at home, you can kind of see how it's applied in other countries and how that helps your case. And obviously, you know, knowing the languages and, oh, sorry, final thing. Another way how this field is very versatile is, especially in the international investment law context, a case can come at you from any industry, like mining or telecommunications or other type of extractive natural resources. So, you know, that's another area where you might develop a niche if you become a subject matter expert for a particular industry.
And in terms of your human rights work, Alex, was that more like you got through that through just volunteer work, or?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Mostly pro bono. Yeah. And basically, if you take care of business on the paying side of things, I mean, you can do carve out as much time as you want for the pro bono work, basically. But even the skills from the paying work, they're very important. Like for these human rights cases, you have to exhaust local remedies. You have to deal with local lawyers and know enough about the local system in the respondent state. You have to get answers out of people who are worried that everything they say is being monitored by their home government. So these kinds of, as I said before, like fact gathering skills. Yeah.
Absolutely. Levon, how about you?
I agree with everything Alex said, but the last comment actually reminded me of I forgot, I won't mention any names, but there was an interaction with one of the partners who said, what, human rights at the law firm? I mean, you know, at what point do we make money? And I thought that was a little bit short-sighted. Well, not that they were belittling, you know, any sort of impact work, because the firm is a big supporter of pro bono. But I think it's short-sighted to think that there isn't any paying work to be found in human rights either. I think, as Alex was saying, and I think Sheila kind of hinted at, is you're most effective in your international human rights work when you bring in either a soft law or a hard law sense of expertise or prior experience to that, in a field tangentially relevant to it or a skill tangentially relevant to it. And a law firm, especially an international law firm, is a great proving ground where you get really intense experience and training early on, and you build a subject matter expertise, and it might be an industry specific expertise. So you have a lot of energy clients or a lot of mining clients, and or even consumer packaged goods clients. But all of those, I think more and more we're seeing they have, whether it's supply chain issues or, trade and sanctions issues related to, for example, I think early this year, the U.S. passed an act that imposed sanctions and trade sanctions specifically on products believed to have made with forced labor out of Xinjiang, forced Uyghur labor. So knowing sort of how that industry works is something you can bring to the table and something you develop in commercial practice completely unrelated to human rights, and then all of a sudden it becomes immediately relevant to this human rights issue. So firms that aren't really putting two and two together in that space, they're going to be missing out 10, 20 years from now on business and human rights practice, ESG practices, those kinds of spaces where their large commercial paying clients actually need that guidance, because any failure to act now leads to costly litigation down the road. And your clients would appreciate you thinking proactively on those spaces, even if whatever strategy they ultimately take in that regard. And just because it's for a paying client or a potential violator, helping them try to reduce the impact of their operations, the human rights toll that their operations take, is human rights work. Essentially, it's preventive work. And it's not all about just retribution against the big bad guy. If you help the big bad guy become a small bad guy, or even a good guy, that's a whole positive aspect to it. So absolutely, I think there's space for not just pro bono human rights work, but also human rights related paying work at law firms.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, and it forces us to be creative and to offer avant-garde thinking to our clients, like you're saying. Now, given everybody's background here and our host of the day, I couldn't go without asking a more Armenian specific question. This is to all our panelists. What challenges do you see, or maybe opportunities, for lawyers with Armenian backgrounds who want to work in this field and who want to advance some of the human rights issues affecting Armenians today? Maybe from your personal experience in the last 20 years or the last 2 years, what are some of those opportunities and challenges that you have observed?
I think generally challenges for the Armenian state are opportunities for Armenian practitioners to get involved in. But challenges for getting involved in the first place, I think, were my sense, at least going through law school, my sense was we were a little underrepresented, and I didn't have many mentors in that space when I was going through the law school experience, and that's something I'm hoping to make a difference in going forward. And I think that this program's a great stepping stone in that regard, and in forging ties between younger practitioners and those with a little more seasoning. But yeah.
Yeah, Nick, yeah.
I would just like make the point that for those that have Armenian nationality, that would be highly prized, because generally the countries from the region are underrepresented in the UN. So that would give you an advantage in applying. And also, of course, most lawyers in Armenia have multiple languages. usually at least 3. And so that would also be an advantage.
I don't really know how to answer the question, because I don't think that, well, I mean, are you saying what challenges do Armenian nationals have to become human rights lawyers?
Or challenges personally as a lawyer with an Armenian background, working in this area or wanting to advance issues that help Armenians? Do you see any particular challenges around that? Like, one thing that I personally experienced was, or at least observed, was a question of, you know, credibility and objectivity. Just because I have an Armenian background, I want to talk on these issues, it's as if that came into question.
Okay, so it's only on the Armenian issues then? You mean what
Yeah, on Armenian
do
related.
Armenians have to do work on Armenian human rights issues?
Yes, yes.
That's like, well,
one challenge that I can
much
think
to
of.
say about that? No.
Go for it.
There are no challenges. Like, everybody can do what they can, but I think that the external perception of bias is somewhat fair, but it's more important to recognize the bias that we have in ourselves. Like, one thing I have spent my whole career working on other people's conflicts before I came here, and I wasn't really super clicked to the Armenia thing. Now I'm a citizen, now I live here, now I'm full throttle, but I think that the lack of objectivity is really big here. Like, it's very, Armenia is the only victim. It's very, it's really black and white, and it's hard to have a conversation about it that's not that. Like, that's not entirely one directional, which is, we're the only ones who've suffered. And I know that I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for that statement, because it's like, how can you see it any other way? You know, some people will say that, but I mean, this is something I argued in a piece that I wrote for Foreign Policy, and it's something I started saying from the outset of the war. We're not supposed to be investigating this. We're not supposed to be actually dealing with this. It should be a third-party international contingent to come and sort of help us sort the mess, because we can't objectively investigate the crimes that were committed against us if we're the victims, and neither can the other side. So that's why the UN exists, and that's why these sort of commissions are created, even though there's a lot of talk about, you know, Armenia should investigate the crimes that their own people committed, and vice versa, Azerbaijan should investigate the same. I mean, how do you really expect them to do that in the context of an international armed conflict, you know? So I think that, given that there is such a high level of international indifference, it seems, to what is actually happening, and unfortunately we are very much alone. I would encourage, learn. I try very, very hard to be as objective as I can when I write the things that I do, and to try to be as fair as I can, so that I am taken seriously. Because just because you're Armenian doesn't mean you can't write about Armenian stuff. Just because you're Armenian really doesn't mean that you can't work on this stuff and be taken seriously as an expert. There are lots of really good Armenian voices out there that are saying intelligent things, and then there are also a lot that aren't, because they're not being careful, you know. It's too emotional, so you got to take the emotion out of it. You got to get your rational brain on, especially if you know what you're talking about, you know. Like, it's hard. We're Armenian, we are emotional, and this is a really horrible thing that happened. A lot of horrible things happened to Armenians, a lot. But if we're going to try to join the international chorus about what to do about it, then we have to tone down the emotion, you know, and get sort of real.
Let me be one of the people who are not going to be, hating on Sheila for what she just said, because I 100% agree. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. you know, I like to think that the two keys to being a good lawyer, at least in a big firm, I'm sure anywhere, is one, resist the urge to be emotional, and two, resist the urge to be lazy. And no, I mean, in the sense that, like, where the objectivity comes in, part of the reason why it's so important to be objective is for the moral reasons and for the truth. But another is because it ends up being counterproductive. Like, when I see lawyers, I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, I just remember seeing things written, like saying, like, these are historical Armenian lands. Like, that's not an argument. That's not a legal argument. Or, you know, when I see them citing Adam Schiff or Frank Pallone in their, like, in legal submissions, like, that's not a good source. Like, spend the extra 8 minutes to find like a better source. So just those two things as a kind of microcosm for, if you're, we need to be involved, and we need to be the ones who participate in these issues, because if we don't, like, no one else will, frankly. But we have to be aware of the bias that exists in ourselves, or the bias that gets perceived to exist by others. And the way you make up for that is you just have to be that much better and that much more objective. And that's another reason why it very much helps to cut your teeth working on other issues and other conflicts, because that other cases, disputes, that teaches you to be objective and clinical about things, and then you can apply that to your own when you find time to work on Armenian things. Like, when I've worked with Armenian clients, like, I mean, just like any other clients, they don't always say everything. They don't always tell the whole truth, and you need to be able to, even if they remind you of your aunt or uncle, like, you need to be able to be a lawyer and know how to uncover everything. So yeah, that's my soapbox.
I would just add that I think that in my 22 years in the international sphere, I never felt it was any disadvantage to be ethnically Armenian. I'm an American national, but if anything, I think it may have been somewhat of an advantage, because of everyone knows the important role that Armenia has had in the history of Armenia in the development of international criminal law.
Yeah, sorry, Nick, though, but like being ethnically Armenian, not a disadvantage, but in the international sphere, when you are an ethnic Armenian trying to make a career for yourself and you start talking about the Armenian genocide and you start attacking Azerbaijan, you become a target, and you can, like, you know that if you start ruffling some feathers, like telling the truth, your job is on the line, because we're not protected at that level, and politically Turkey's powerful, and like these things happen. So there is a little bit of concern. It's not just because you're Armenian, it's if you say the wrong thing, even if you're not Armenian and you say something about the Armenian genocide, or you say something, I'm sure now if you start saying, you know, Azerbaijan is guilty of ethnic cleansing and war crimes, whatever, in the hallways of Geneva or the UN, you'll lose your job. And it's okay to say it about one thing but not the other, like that's so it's a consideration, because of course at the UN you're not supposed to be political, you're not supposed to express any kind of political opinion, but people do, and some things are a little harder to say than others. But yeah, I think that we have to be, Armenians have to be less emotional but also brave, you know, like it's those who are in real positions of power, those who really have the opportunity to make a difference, are sometimes too scared to do it because the repercussions are high. So there's like, that's for real. I mean, I know a lot of people who I'm sometimes surprised, well, I haven't heard them say much, you know, and it's like, because they could actually lose their job if they start rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in trying to help the cause. You know what I mean? Do you agree or not? Am I off? Or you don't want to say anything about it?
You have to name names. No, I'm kidding.
The solution is to become a consultant and give yourself more freedom, right, Sheila?
That's for sure. I mean, but that's not always that also I was I can also get turned down for jobs if I express myself too much, and it happened once. So I was like,
Yeah, so it's a challenge. It's a real challenge.
yeah, and you have to pick your battles, you know. Like, I'm not going to stop publishing. I'm not going to stop publishing. I'm more about quality than quantity. I want to say what I have to say, and I couldn't do that when I worked for the UN. I can publish now as a consultant, but stuff you do on Twitter, like, you got to be. Oh, that's another thing. If you want to have like a serious careers in international human rights, I mean, I guess Twitter helps and stuff, but the things that you put out in social media can really come haunt you. And so I tend to be very, very careful about that now and try to, because it is who it is, it becomes your brand, you know, and then you're perceived as a hardliner on one issue and you can't be objective. So it's important to be careful, like what you put out there and how much you engage in the hated sphere that is Twitter.
Yeah. I haven't worked in the public sphere, especially at the UN level, and I think there's a whole level of sensibility and sensitivity that goes into that. But even in the law firm space, especially as a junior associate or in your early to middle years, you have very much have your own brand that you're developing, and it's a brand that could stick with you as you advance. And you may not always be counsel, you may not always be an advocate, you may eventually be appointed as an adjudicator of sorts, a mediator, an arbitrator. And so your brand needs to have that element of objectivity, of fairness, and being able to see both sides. But that doesn't mean you're not allowed to have an opinion. And that's something that I struggled with as well for quite a few years, about is it safe for me to say this, and will it come back to haunt me later? And I think sitting down and thinking about it, and breaking down what I know to be true, why I know it to be true, and what I think, things that I think and why I think them, kind of helps me figure out what am I comfortable saying and having come back to me 5-10 years later when my objectivity or credibility is being questioned. And that kind of it hasn't at first. It helped me deal with sort of the fear of speaking, but now it's a source of confidence for me, because with practice you learn to defend your opinions better, and you learn to defend your understanding of the facts better. And if you can't defend it, then you think long and hard about why. and yeah, it's kind of it opened the door for me to take a stronger position on advocacy and knowing what's effective. And because if I can't defend it to myself, how do I expect others to take it on? So yeah, I think it's an advocacy skill in itself, even though ultimately it's kind of a meta thing where you're not dealing with the issue itself, but more the credibility of the speaker. But as litigators, you're doing that all the time with cross-examinations and questioning the credibility of the other side's purported experts, etc. So, yeah.
Definitely. Was there anyone else who wanted to jump in before I move on to our next question? So as practitioners in this area in human rights law, is there any particular resources or organizations or podcasts or maybe even Twitter feeds, since it was mentioned, that you guys go to or like to inform yourselves through, or find useful to keep your, yourself up to date, and that you would recommend others also look into, maybe particularly in new and emerging areas, whether maybe it's gender-based violence or other specialties that you guys work in?
I mean, I only read like 3 or 4 media outlets, and that's it. And then briefly dip my toe occasionally into Twitter just to see what's going on and quickly get out. Just to, because it's like the and it's only for the Armenia stuff, and it's quick and out and don't engage. But for global, like I read foreign policy, foreign affairs, New York Times, and what is it? The New Yorker, I think. Okay. And like, yeah, that's it. I get everything I need, especially from foreign policy. I think it's really good.
Okay, oh, good to know.
For news, I think it's interesting every time EurasiaNet publishes anything about Armenia, because they have an editorial board from a variety of countries, and they do have reporters from Armenia that write on those topics, but they kind of go through a vetting, I guess, before they get published. And similarly for Azatotun, Radio Liberty is technically US funded, I think, still, but they do have sort of stations across the Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So, there's some level of, I guess, not commitment to consistency or minimum standards of journalism. Obviously, both of those are not as up to the moment for new developments, but they're more interesting in terms of what gets accepted as credible evidence and or a accepted factual narrative. So that helps stay up to date on what the outside messaging is. And additionally, I think attending conferences is good, but get involved in conferences, become part of the dialogue. I think, doesn't matter how junior you are. If you're a junior, maybe not a panelist, but maybe working as a, either supporting a moderator, supporting one of the panelists, or helping organize a program and get others to help you. There's no better way to really immerse yourself in an issue or than putting together a group of experts and getting involved in that dialogue and making those connections, and when you do that, you kind of force the group to discuss what the cutting edge issues are, and figuring out what isn't like already established, which is just as important as figuring out what is established, and building the discussion on those topics.
CivilNet is a good source for news about Armenia.
I read Azatotun in Armenian, Sputnik na Ruskom, just to know what the Kremlin is saying, and what they don't cover is very illuminating. And for like international law blogs and stuff, I read EJIL, European Journal of International Law Talk. I know she has contributed some articles to that one. And for other news, Wall Street Journal. But I know that's expensive and you have to subscribe to that. But.
Well, I also really like international crisis groups stuff. I think it's really top notch. So everything that they write, but also their stuff on Nagorno-Karabakh, like they have this visual explainer. It's really good. And I mean, I'm still coming at it from international human rights law. Like if you want to keep up with what's going on in human rights in the world overall, like just maybe pick one. I wouldn't do Amnesty, but I'd follow like Human Rights Watch. They have little updates, and then you just know what's going on. It's a really good organization and can follow what's going on with human rights all over the world.
Well, yeah, we still have a few minutes left. There's a couple of questions in the chat. They might be a little bit beyond the topic of the panel, but I'll throw it out there. And if you guys want to give your initial comments, one of them is a question regarding whether a US-based NGO could file a lawsuit against Azerbaijan for the losses that they suffered from the war, having invested in the areas that were hit during the war. And the question is whether they could file in the US or international courts. We probably don't have enough facts or details to to answer specifically to your particular situation, but maybe in general, if you have some comments on how that kind of mechanism could work in a different forums, we could address it that way.
Levon and I have been fighting and debating about this very question. Where, let's just say, we're happy to talk to Mr. Bornazian offline. That might be the best.
Okay, great. So if you want to contact our panelists, they're happy to talk to you offline. Another reader wanted to thank you for your submission to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We have another.
That's Alex in particular. I think that was his.
Yes, thank you, Alex.
His contribution. Yes.
Okay, great. Another question is more regarding maybe it's a political question, more than legal, but whether you have any thoughts on which forum you feel would be better to ensure the protection of human rights in the Karabakh issue, whether it's through the Minsk group or through direct negotiations between Republic of Armenia and Azerbaijan to negotiate a treaty to resolve their issues. I mean, there's a lot of overlap between the legal and the political in the international spheres, but.
Well, I mean, look, I'm probably the least connected to Armenian government, but the goal needs to be, if they have to sign a peace treaty, the goal needs to be to sign one that explicitly leaves open the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. If they sign a peace treaty where both countries recognize each other's borders and territorial integrity, and it doesn't mention Nagorno-Karabakh, to me, that's pretty much the ball game, because that was Azerbaijan's goal. Yeah, to my view, Russia is not interested in the status being resolved. It wants the status to stay unresolved well into the future. And that's also the optimal position for Armenians if our goal is to, keep open the chance of Karabakh not being part of Azerbaijan. So, I don't envy the current government, but this is the task that they face. They have to sign, if they're going to sign a peace treaty, it has to explicitly leave open the status of Nagorno-Karabakh, because silence would mean they accept it as part of Azerbaijan. It's my opinion, not attributable to anyone else.
Well, we have a couple minutes left, and I invite our panelists if they have any other remarks they want to add, anything we didn't cover, any questions they wish I had asked but I didn't ask, or if they have any final thoughts or remarks before I close things out. This is your chance. Oh, Nick, you're on mute.
I would just say to the younger viewers that I think a career in human rights or in international criminal law can be extremely fulfilling. I don't regret at all my career choice. I feel very, very privileged to have worked on issues, including the ones I'm working on now, and the constant crimes against humanity being committed in Myanmar and trying to do something against it. So I think it's a intellectually challenging field. It's very interesting because of the people you meet from all over the world with many different backgrounds, and the feeling that you hope that your work is doing some good on very important issues.
I'll piggyback on that, because I think that it just dawned on me while Nick was saying that one blind spot I think that a lot of Armenians have is that they don't see, we all know there's other human rights violations going on around the world, but we tend to just focus on this one and not see what's going on elsewhere, and give enough attention to it. Like if anyone looks closely at what Nick is working on and the situation for Rohingya, for example, it's actually quite similar to what is probably looking like it's going to happen to them. Like the issues are similar. These are people who are being expelled from their indigenous lands because of a government that is hostile to them. And, it's like it's not just happening to us. It's not just happening to Armenians, and it hasn't always just happened to Armenians. So if we can get involved in taking a more global view of the problem, then perhaps we can be a better part of the solution, because it's not gonna help to just scream me, like focus only on us. Like we have to sort of be part of this solution because we're among those populations that are affected by these sorts of, unfortunately, by these sorts of crimes. So I'd say sort of look outside yourself and look around the world to see how this is a global problem and not just an Armenian problem.
100%. Most of my human rights experience before I touched anything Armenian related was related to other, specific projects related to other jurisdictions, Myanmar included, very early on. But yeah, one other thing I would add is international law is huge. You don't have to be working at the UN or being a team lead on an international law case to make an impact in international law. And I think one thing, that Armenia is still coming to terms with is a lack of sort of coherent strategy for many decades. And, we're working now to build factual records of facts that we've known, for decades, but that from a credibility perspective, it's hard to reestablish them every single time and go through and dig up those archives, and sort of creating objective report assessments of those things, and creating sort of a factual record, especially at the international level, that can be referred to over and over again, in the future, without redoing the hard lifting every single time you need it, that's valuable. It's important. And that can be a one-off project that you do, and as 20 hours of pro bono between M&A cases. I don't know. It could be. It doesn't. You don't need to be at the UN to make an impact.
And even participating in a panel like this and encouraging young lawyers and giving them advice and insight is part of that work, I think. And you guys are doing a great job. And I mean, it's insightful, it's inspiring, and we're very thankful for your participation here today. In closing, I'd like to thank everybody again. If our attendees have a few minutes to fill out a survey, which will be circulating in the chat and email, we would greatly appreciate it. And if you have other questions, you can reach out to us personally or through the ABA. We'd be happy to address them. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.